Hi everyone, this is your studio for week 6, I believe we're in. And today it's just an overview of what we'll be looking at for assessment 2 and everything that you'll need to be starting to think about. So this should give you a rough idea of what assessment 2 is about, but you will need to obviously read the design brief and the assessment outline. So for my purposes, I've just prepared a bit of an overview of what assessment 2's content should look like. And I'm just going to talk you through that really briefly. And again, this is just our first conversation about what this assessment will involve. You will see that last night I modified the assessment. There's now a revised assessment outline in your Blackboard site. So that will give you an idea of what's changed. Basically, I have removed some of the content. I'm conscious that this is quite a difficult learning environment and it's something that we're all new to. So I have removed one of the sheet requirements, which you may have seen in there if you had looked at it previously, which was a plant selection, I guess a plant palette of what you're going to include for planting for this project. So that's been removed from this assessment. And we did originally have 2 1-to-100 sections that were going to be required, and I've changed that to only 1-to-100 section. So this assessment, as you are aware, is about detailed design. It's about preparing a concept for our project site. So the first part of the assessment is obviously it needs to have a cover. I won't explain that. It'll be very similar to what you prepared last time, and you'll see an overview of that in the assessment outline. The second requirement is basically to prepare a design narrative, then a master plan, then we'll be looking at an indicative materials palette, a 1-to-100 concept design, and then a 1-to-100 section and an artist's impression. So I just wanted to talk to you very briefly about what each of these pages will include. So the first page that has technical information on it is basically your design narrative. So as per our last assessment, you want to include your title block, and your title block should be consistent with what you had been preparing in your assessment 1 outputs. So you have your title block information. Obviously this assessment has a different name to the previous assessment, so it is still country as a classroom, but this time we're actually looking at detailed design development for this assessment. So your design narrative sheet is really about applying the knowledge that you've developed over the course of assessment 1. So you want to develop a critical response to site planning and to develop a concept design based on that translates your understanding of various design elements into a design narrative, which then informs your design. So basically you want to be considering our Indigenous placemaking lecture, our site analysis and affordance analysis that we did of the site previously. And you really want to be interrogating and interpreting the stakeholder feedback, which I'll provide to you as a data set in coming days. And then what it's about is translating that into a design narrative initially, and then into a design. So a design narrative is usually a text overview. It may be diagrammatic and text that explains how your design has become what it is and what has informed it. So this can be explained on this A3 sheet in both text and diagram only. So it might be that you say that there are sort of three key things that you're considering for this assessment. The first one may be that you're considering Indigenous placemaking. You're also considering all of your previous analysis. And you're also considering the stakeholder feedback, which will be provided to you. Obviously, we were going to undertake the stakeholder engagement ourselves, but with COVID-19, we're no longer able to have that face-to-face engagement. And I'll talk more about that in coming weeks. So you might want to say that these are the 3 things you're considering. You may want to do it as a diagram that sort of talks about that's a process that you consider this, then this, then this. You may want to have some text that outlines why you've explained it in that sort of way and why they're the 3 key things that are informing your design process. It may be that you want this whole page to basically be text and explain what you've considered of each of these elements. So the design narrative is really an explanation of key things that we have discussed and the information that's going to inform your design. And as I said, this can be any name, any sort of diagram. It might be that you have a Venn diagram that talks about how these 3 things interact and that this is your design process as an outcome. It may be that you have a diagram that talks about the stages of design that you went through, that you're first considering Indigenous design, principles, then you're considering your analysis principles, and then at the end you're considering feedback. It may be that you think the feedback from the engagement is most important, which I would say is something you should definitely be considering. What is most important for your design outcome, and what are the key things from each of these different areas that are informing your design? So when we talk about analysis, we talk about CPTED, wayfinding, what else do we talk about? Universal design, etc. When we talk about the feedback that you'll be reviewing, you'll be looking at BCC's feedback, the feedback from facilities management, the feedback from Indigenous stakeholders. And when we talk about Indigenous placemaking, what are the key considerations about design? So ensuring that we don't have appropriation through design, and how your design will respond to this site without appropriating culture. So it's really, the design narrative is an overview of everything that has informed how you've come to designing what you are going to design. What is informing every decision that you've made? What is the depth of information that you're interrogating about each of these things that will lead to a really strong design outcome? So that's sort of what your design narrative will be starting to think about. And you want to start contemplating that now. We've done our analysis. We know what's there with regards to CPTED and wayfinding and universal design, etc. currently. What does universal design mean for this new project? What does CPTED mean for this project? What do we need to consider about safety on this site? How many more cameras do we need? Do we need to be conscious that the site is going to open up to the gardens, and therefore there may be more public members coming through into the site? So your design narrative is something that you'll usually think about at the very beginning, and then you'll revisit throughout the entirety of your project, and you may even come back to it at the very end and modify it to make sure that it does truly reflect what your design outcomes are. So the next sheet is the master plan, and those of you who have come from landscape architecture will be familiar with this concept. Those of you who maybe haven't, it may be a bit more new to you, I guess. What I'm suggesting for your master plan is that you're going to want to probably have a 1 to 500 A3 site plan. And what I'm going to put on Blackboard for you, and you'll see in your assessment overview in the design brief, that there are 3 buildings that we need to site within this new landscape. And basically that landscape is a space where X block's current property boundary occurs. So you must stay within the property boundary. And we can talk about in our master planning week about what good master planning of this site will mean. What I have done is I have made a cutout version of these 3 buildings for you, namely for those people who can't use AutoCAD. If you can use AutoCAD, you can obviously make these in AutoCAD yourself and manipulate and move them across this landscape that you're going to be undertaking the master plan for. For those of you who don't have AutoCAD, what I would suggest is that you print out your 1 to 500 A3. You print out the sheet that has the buildings on it, also at A3. And then you can actually start to play with these 3 buildings and how they could sit on this site. You'll know, if you've read the project assessment brief, that we're basically looking at how we create good pockets across this landscape. Sometimes when architects and landscape architects work in isolation, we end up with unusual spaces that aren't that usable. And we'll talk again more about this when we start to look at the master planning of the site. So we will have these 3 buildings which need to be placed somewhere within the perimeter of this project boundary. And how you lay those out is what's going to need detailed thought and consideration as to what the best layout is to get good functioning spaces between each of these buildings. And there are a number of options for layouts, and it's really about considering where the best where the best spaces can be aligned for your project purpose. And that is that we need to either design a space that is a front of house space to the museum and retail building. And we also need to create an educational courtyard that somehow is linked between the Karumba Institute, the Udjuru unit, and the community centre. So for example, if this was our layout, we don't really have a front of house space where people would approach the museum and retail precinct. So it might be, this layout may, for example, not work very well. This building may need to be set back further. The Karumba Institute may need to sort of go on its side. the community centre at the back. So this example, I guess, creates a clear front of house space where people would approach the museum and retail building, and also a clear internal learning courtyard which connects between these two buildings, or in fact all three buildings. So it's about looking at your options for how best you can lay out your site to get the best landscape pockets working between them. So that's for you to play with and consider. There will be solutions that are more appropriate than other solutions. Please bear in mind that you can connect to Y block. There are opportunities for your buildings to sit hard up against Y block and be connected through the likes of an air bridge or through cutouts between this building and between Y block's existing building and new buildings. So you can go hard up against Y block, hard up against the property boundaries. It's really at your discretion as to what you think the best layouts for that master plan will be. Either way, out of that, you will obviously create some spaces. Let's just go with this as an option for now, where you'll need to have a space that you can either design as your 1:100 front of house space or as your courtyard. And for your 1:100s for this assessment, you'll only be designing one or the other. So that brings us to, I guess, a materials palette. So once you've started to think about what your design narrative is, what your master plan layout's going to be, and you'll start considering what your designs, what may be included in your designs to give them a certain sense of place. So it may be for your next sheet that you start thinking about the type of materiality of the surfaces. So I've said for this page, which is your materials palette, that you will basically need to include eight indicative images of the types of materials that you'll be considering, and a bit of an explanation about why. So it may be that you could do this many different ways. It may be that you have 4 images across the top, and then a bit of an overview, some text about why you've selected them. Oops. It may be that you break it into a cluster of 4, that this one is all about your ground surfaces, and this one is all about your tactiles and your details and the feel of the space. But basically I want to see 8 examples of the types of materiality that will be included into your design. So it's an indicative palette to get a sense of character and feel of what your site will be like. So for example, and this may not be appropriate to this design, you may have a whole lot of stainless steel, a lot of glass, so a lot of sort of shiny, high-end, sophisticated features. Or it might be that you go for a design palette that's generally a little bit rougher. So it might be that you have sort of core 10, I guess, frames or landscape structures, core 10 with a lot of timber, and that will make up a more sort of natural style of palette. So thinking about the texture and the types of materials to give people a sense of how the site will feel based on your narrative and the type of character that you're trying to create. Of course, you'll be needing to create a 1:100 plan. This is realistically the major part of this assessment, is your 1:100 design. And so as per usual, you'll need to have your scale, you'll need to have your north arrow, etc. And your 1:100 plan will be of, this is very important, either the front of house space or the learning courtyard. So depending on which space you pick, so for example, if we had something like the edge of Kidney Lawn over here, and then we've got Main Drive, which sort of comes up alongside Kidney Lawn, and we've basically decided that our museum and retail building will sort of sit off to the side here, then this space here becomes the area that we would be designing as our 1:100 front of house. So for example, if this is our museum building and these are our doors into the museum building, remembering that this is a 2-story building, basically your 1:100, and this scale probably isn't quite right, is a detailed design of this space. So it might be that you're going to have some sort of big meandering wide path that's sort of, 3 or 4 meters wide. You may have some sort of buffer landscape off to the side, some soft landscape sort of surrounding the perimeter of this entranceway. It may be that you have a couple of big shade trees into that space. You may have some turf with some signage and wayfinding amongst that. It may be that we have a picnic table that's wheelchair accessible where a wheelchair can pull up to, for example. So your 1 to 100 will be quite a detailed design. It'll be a rendered plan, be either Photoshop rendered or rendered by hand. And this will be the major component of your work. So your design narrative should be about why your path is shaped like this, why you have vegetation here. Your materials palette will talk about why all your fixtures and furniture are made from timber to give a natural look and feel, for example. It's about making sure that you have considered all of your analysis, all of the stakeholder feedback, and all of your findings from the previous assessment to inform what would make a great design for an Indigenous placemaking perspective for this site. So for example, how open or closed it is, whether these are clean trunk trees so that we can maintain views across the site, and crime prevention by having open views into the site so it's a safe space. Thinking about what good wayfinding and signage should be, where it should be. Should it be on the buildings? Should it be in the landscape? Should it be right at the front? Because then what we're going to do for our next page is we're going to do a 1 to 100 cross section basically of this design. So as I said, we were going to do 2 of these. We're now only going to do, that should be a 1 to 100 section, all your usual title block information. But in this instance, we want to make sure the section is through a space in our design that is interesting and informative. So for example, we may cut our section right through this area of our design. And the reason we might do that is because it's picking up our examples around how we're going to have shade trees, we've got turf, we've got signage and wayfinding, we've got a cut through the path, we've got some landscape general features, and again, sort of more natural features. So a cross section through this space is very informative for what it would indicate about how this design functions. So what we could do, for example, if this was our section, is we'd probably obviously draw this to scale at 1 to 100, and our section would probably look something like this. It's probably going to have a tree for some shade. We mentioned that there was sort of turf for a large part, and then there was quite a large path, and that we also had tree on this side. We mentioned that we had a picnic table over here, so we've sort of got this universally accessible picnic table. And I think we spoke about having some signage and wayfinding as well on the other side of the path. So it might be that we have some sort of very big signage and wayfinding element, for example, like this. This is our path that people are walking on. How wide is this? How many people does it accommodate? And our section should really start to talk about some of those not universal design necessarily, some of those affordances and reasons why this design is designed the way it is. So for example, the reason that we have clean trunk trees is to ensure that there's good visibility when someone is standing over here and looking into the site. Very clear lines of sight, because we haven't got, for example, if we had dense shrubbery and we had someone standing over here, then they can't see anything, and that makes a space unsafe. So it's also looking at scale, like what does scale mean? A cross section is very good for indicating that clearly we've got these large trees, they're providing shade to our seating area. It may be that we have some sort of big arbor structure, for example, that may go over the top of the path, again to provide shade or protection from the weather. So the cross section is about providing that extra detail that the 1 to 100 plan has illustrated, but gives an example of what this would look like in a section sort of alignment. So these 2 pages are probably your key components of your work with regards to where your marking sits, where your design has been translated from all of your background information. Okay, so that's your 1 to 100 plan and your 1 to 100 section. Your last page is an artist's impression, and an artist's impression is really your big marketing sell. And this can be any sort of, I guess, creative expression of your site. It could be a beautiful photo montage that you've done in Photoshop of, you know, how this will look. It could be a painting, it could be a hand sketch, it could be a very detailed drawing, but it is a perspective. It's an artist's impression of what the design feels like. So for the design that we just very quickly drew then, it might be that you have sort of an image, sort of a perspective image of the landscape of this new building. Got this beautiful new museum building. Please don't spend a lot of time on the architecture when you're working on this. This is a landscape assessment, so it's about capturing sort of the essence of this space. So we sort of spoke about having this big meandering path maybe that sort of cuts through the landscape, these turf areas. We had these big trees sort of off to the side which sort of frame the building, big signage and wayfinding, lots of happy people laughing and walking up to the building. It might sort of show that the building has got some sort of major branding across it that talks about that it's a museum and retail precinct. You know, it might capture sort of the different features that you've got in there, be it sort of your seating areas, and just sort of give a general artistic feel of what the space feels like. And this can be taken from any angle of your design. What I don't want to see is a replica of what I've obviously drawn today. This is just my interpretation of a very quick one-off sketch that I would do, thinking about where my design sort of might be laid out and how it may be laid out across this assessment. So these are the main things that you'll need to basically be thinking about for your assessment. So you've got your artist's impression, just going back the other way. You've got your cross-section of your design. You've got your design. Remember, a majority of your marking sits in this 1 to 100 plan of why you've positioned your buildings where they are, why this is the front of house space that you've chosen, what is this trying to achieve. For example, if this is Kidney Lawn and this is our new museum building, and this is sort of the gateway to this new Indigenous precinct, how does this building and this landscape stand off as an Indigenous place to sort of the Kidney Lawn and Old Government House precinct, which is a very colonial overlay? And how do these landscapes interface? This is a conflicted landscape, it is a contested landscape, and there's an opportunity to draw on the fact that it's a contested landscape in the way that we design this space. So that's almost a challenge between the two landscapes, or a complementary landscape where this is a safe space to welcome both cultures into a new precinct. So these are the sorts of things you want to be thinking about with regards to your design narrative. Of course, before that, you've got your materials palette, which sort of gives you an indication of your touch and look and feel, what you're trying to create as a landscape character for that space. So looking at materiality, styles, exemplars, and images. And then before that, we've obviously got our master plan, which will be a drawn out version of how you see this site laid out. Obviously, for the example I just prepared then, it's probably something like this, or like this, or something along those lines. This was our front of house space that we just did a quick design mock-up of, a 1 to 100 of that space, or a 1 to 100 of your learning courtyard, which is, if you read the design brief, is about creating a space for students and staff to undertake their work and for community to use on a casual basis as well. So you'll be doing either or of these 1 to 100 spaces, and you'll need to pick that once you've done your master plan. And then before that was basically your design narrative. Design narrative can be written, text, graphical. It's not photos. It is an overview of how your design has been informed by all of the background information. Okay, everybody, I think that's probably all you need at this stage. We can talk more throughout our one-on-one calls today and in our chat forum this afternoon. All right, hope you're all staying healthy. I'll speak with you soon. See you.